Well, thank you all so much for being here, especially given the weather and the fact that there is no heat in the building. I am grateful for the invitation to come and present this work. So today I'm going to talk about two short papers about government formation. And these papers address classic questions, and they also share a broader goal of trying to bring closer the empirical and theoretical sides of this literature. Before I get into details, I want to say a word about why government formation matters. So in parliamentary democracies, election results don't tell us directly who governs. What really matters is how the election results get translated into the government. So which parties get in, who gets the prime ministerial position, how is power shared across parties. And these things affect policy outcomes and accountability and representation. And can vary dramatically even when the election results look pretty similar. So what this means is that understanding government formation is central to understanding how democratic politics works. So I'm going to talk about these two questions today. And the first paper is more methodological. And we're trying to figure out how best to model who gets into government and in a way that reflects what we think theoretically is going on in the government formation process. The second paper is more substantive. And here we're looking at how power is shared across coalition parties in a coalition government. And we're going to revisit this longstanding puzzle about whether the prime ministerial party is advantaged or disadvantaged when portfolios are allocated. Right, so this first paper is co-authored with Garrett Glasgow and Matt Golder. What we're doing is we're trying to jointly model the choice of the prime minister and the government in parliamentary democracies. Theoretical work on government formation is a really large literature in political science. It's strongly established. The empirical side of this literature has been a little bit slower to develop, and in part that's because we've had a harder time figuring out exactly what methodological approaches to use so that our empirics kind of match our theories. The original work, the early empirical work, was really focused on why some parties get into government and others don't. And so empirical scholars treated the parties as the unit of analysis. So a party would get into government or it wouldn't, and that's a natural kind of 0-1 sort of dependent variable. So you use a binary choice model like a logit or a probit, and to focus on how party characteristics affect the likelihood of being in government. The basic idea is a party in a government formation opportunity would or wouldn't get into government. So this term of government formation opportunity is really important in this literature, and that just means the moment at which a government might form. So after an election, you have a government formation opportunity. It can also occur between elections. So if a government has collapsed or failed a vote of no confidence or what have you. And so in these studies, you'd have a data structure that looks something like this. And I have country 1, country 2, formation opportunities within these countries. And then my parties, the units of analysis. The dependent variable is, does this party get into office or not? So it's coded 0 or 1. And they have characteristics of these parties. And these would be things like the party's legislative size. Was it in the previous government? Is it the medium party? Party family, things like this. As I said, scholars would use something like a logit model. And the drawback to using the logit model with parties as the units of observation is we're assuming that all the parties are in. It assumes that each party in a formation opportunity is an independent observation. So whether it gets into government or not depends only on the characteristics of that party. And the problem is that if you think about how a government, especially a coalition government, would form, whether a party gets into government depends also on the broader context. It depends on the characteristics and the preferences of the other parties sort of in that government formation opportunity. So there was a big advance in the literature when scholars proposed that we should look at the government formation opportunity as our unit of analysis instead. And this goes back to Martin and Stevenson in 2001. And so essentially what we're doing now is we're thinking about government choice as a multinomial discrete choice problem I have a set of potential governments, and we're selecting one of these governments out of this set. And when I say a potential government, I mean any party or collection of parties, combination of parties that could form a government. If I have a legislature with 3 parties, A, B, and C, I have 7 potential governments, because party A or B or C could go into government on their own, and I have all the other combinations of parties, A, B, A, C, etc. And so now my data structure looks a little different. Here's just one formation opportunity. So this is one unit of analysis. And now I'm going to have all of my potential governments. And again, we'll see which only one of these, in this case, AC, would be chosen as the potential, as the actual government. And now my independent variables are characteristics of the potential government. So again, we can think of size. What's the share of the legislative seats that this potential government controls? Is it the selection of parties that was in the previous government? Does it control the median party? How many parties in government? These kinds of characteristics. And so scholars used a conditional logit to deal with this new approach. And the main thing that's going on here is that with the conditional logit, you're taking account of the characteristics of potential government J. At the same time, you are also considering the characteristics of the other potential governments. So using this approach solves some of the problems of the logit model that I mentioned earlier. And we can examine with this approach how the characteristics of potential governments affect their likelihood of getting into office. And we can do this because it produces predicted probabilities of each potential government. And at that point, you can do sort of a standard baseline scenario and compare it to a counterfactual scenario. So we could see, for example, a potential government that has minority status. Like, how much more likely is it to get into government if it's a majority government? When scholars shifted from looking at parties to looking at potential governments, it shifted the questions they were asking a little bit, but it turns out you can still back out the probabilities of a party getting into government. You can do this pretty simply. If I want to know the probability of party A getting into government, I can add up the probabilities of all of the potential governments that include party A. And I could do the same for party B, party C, etc. The key limitation of the conditional logit model is that it doesn't allow us to deal with any unobserved heterogeneity, any unobserved factors that might influence why some potential governments might be more or less likely to form than others. And this has substantive and methodological issues. Substantively, we know from country experts and case studies and qualitative work that there are a lot of contextual factors, there are idiosyncratic things that affect how a particular government formation process works. And we would ignore all of that methodologically. If you ignore unobserved heterogeneity, it violates the conditional logit model's assumption of IAA. This is a problem because it means we have inconsistent parameter estimates, and also going to incorrectly estimate the substantive effects of our independent variables, these things we care about. Turns out you can fix those problems if you shift to a different model, the random coefficients mixed logit model. And this is just like the conditional logit model I showed you before, except that we now can allow our coefficients to vary across formation opportunities. It allows us to take account of the fact that there might be heterogeneity, and we're going to get a mean coefficient that gives us the average effect of one of our independent variables, as well as a standard deviation that tells us the extent to which the magnitude of that effect varies across formation opportunities. Same exact data structure as before. Okay. So there's still this gap between theory and empirics. All of the existing studies distinguish between the potential governments based solely on which parties are in that potential government. So it's just about the partisan composition. This ignores the identity of the prime ministerial party. But do you think that a potential AB government where A is the prime ministerial party is the same as a BA government where B is the prime ministerial party? There's no way in which party leaders or the voters see these governments as interchangeable. And the existing empirical studies treat them as the same because we're only looking at which parties are in a potential government. Later theoretical models of government formation also recognize that the identity of the prime ministerial party matters. And a lot of the early models in particular treat the government formation process as sequential and nested. And so you see here, so maybe in a first stage, we have the proposer, this formateur party who's trying to put a government together. If party A is the formateur party, what they're looking to do is create a government in which they will be the prime ministerial party. They're only looking at government possibilities where they're in the government. And so this AB government is going to form following a different process than the BA government. And even if you say, well, those models are sort of rigid and artificial, and you come up with a different kind of model, different theoretical approach where the prime ministerial party rises endogenously, it's still clear that these choices are jointly determined. But as I said, the existing empirical studies either look at the choice of government or they look at the choice of prime minister. And one of the reasons is because it's been really hard to figure out how do you do both. So we have a proposed solution, and we don't need a new estimation strategy. We just have to rethink how we're going to identify our potential governments. So what we're doing is we're going to define them the same way as before, except that a potential government with same partisan composition but different prime ministerial parties will be treated as a distinct choice alternative. So my same legislature with 3 parties as before, I now have 12 different alternatives, right? 12 different potential governments, A, AB, AC, ABC, B, BA, et cetera. And the first party is the prime ministerial party. The number of formation opportunities looks the same as is exactly the same as before. So this data structure looks the same. I just have a larger set of alternatives from which one potential government is chosen. So as before, I can look at the probability of a particular government forming. I can examine the probability that a particular party is in government. Now I can look at the probability that a particular party is the prime ministerial party. So we just have to rethink how we identify the potential governments, and then it's straightforward to jointly model and examine what factors influence which party becomes the prime ministerial party, which parties get into government. I'll show you a quick empirical application. This, we're using 17 non-presidential democracies in Western Europe. We have 3 different sets of independent variables. And the first set focuses on characteristics of the potential governments. Things like, what is the seat share of the potential government? Does it contain the largest legislative party? What's the number of parties? What type of government, et cetera? So these are variables that you would not be able to include in a model if you were looking at just prime ministerial party choice. The second set is exactly characteristics of prime ministerial party choice. And so you might be wondering how we take account of party characteristics when our alternatives are potential governments. And what we do is have variables like the potential prime ministerial party's seat share, right? In a potential government, is the potential prime ministerial party the largest legislative party, the incumbent prime ministerial party, median party, et cetera. And so these are variables that you couldn't have in a traditional model of government choice. Our third set are new because they combine both the choice of government and the choice of prime minister. So one example is looking at the weighted ideological distance of the potential prime ministerial party to the other parties in the potential government. Could also look at whether the prime ministerial party is the largest party in that government alternative. Okay. So I only have a few of the variables shown here. This is a mixed logit model, which means that it's giving us a mean coefficient, the average effect of each of our variables, and a standard deviation, which tells us whether that effect varies across formation opportunities. And that's why you see the two columns. The fact that the standard deviations of the coefficients are significant means we should not have used a conditional logit model. The coefficient on this variable, government includes the largest legislative party, is positive and significant, and that tells us that on average, potential governments that include the largest legislative party are more likely to get into office. Its standard deviation is highly significant and large, and that tells us that this effect varies. And if you do a few more calculations, you would find that 60% of the time in this data set, it is really helpful to have the largest party. 40% of the time, though, it has a negative effect. And it turns out that as the distance between a potential prime ministerial party and the other parties in the government increases, it does reduce the likelihood of that party getting, of that potential government being chosen, which is something that we would expect given our theories of how government formation works, but not something that we were previously able to test. Right. Also show you quickly a substantive example. So take Sweden in the 2010 elections. Social Democratic Party was the largest party with 112 seats. The moderate party, second largest with 107 seats. The moderate party was the outgoing prime ministerial party and actually was part of the larger of the electoral alliances. So what you can do with a case like this is we can calculate probabilities in a baseline scenario. And so we figured out the probabilities of both parties getting into government and becoming the prime ministerial party with the values set to the actual values in Sweden in 2010. Then we can calculate a counterfactual scenario. And this is where we've flipped the identity of the largest parties. We've swapped their seat shares. And then you can see, calculate change in probabilities to see what difference this makes. And this is the kind of analysis you can do, especially if there are particular cases that you find compelling or interesting. You can use that to see how changes in your variables are going to affect these kinds of outcomes. Okay. So we found that this approach gets us closer, gets our empirics kind of closer to our theory. Our next step is to update our data set. We currently have data on both Western and Eastern Europe, which I didn't show you, through 2018. So I'd like to bring that closer to the present, and that's then going to allow us to test new implications that link prime ministerial party choice with partisan government choice, and also revisit some existing hypotheses, right? And we'll see if some factors, perhaps only matter for prime ministerial party choice or only for government choice. I'm going to turn to the second paper now. So when we're talking about bargaining over who gets in, we're also naturally talking about bargaining over who gets what. And so you can think about how parties are going to bargain over dividing up the spoils of office. So think about how the ministerial positions, what we call portfolios, are distributed in a coalition government. And we're also going to talk specifically about whether there's a prime ministerial party advantage. Okay, and so this is co-authored work with Niels Christian Bormann and Jinhyuk Jang. If you think about forming a coalition government, each party brings some resources to the table. And this can be their legislative seat share. It could be their pivotality. William Gamson, back in 1961, proposed that cabinet parties are going to get ministerial portfolios in proportion to the resources that they bring, that they contribute to the government. And so let me just briefly explain Gamson's law. as an example, take party A controls 80 seats, party B controls 40 seats. They form a government. The government controls 120 seats. Party A then should get 2/3 of the cabinet portfolios because it's providing 2/3 of the government seats, and party B should get 1/3. Scholars noticed, though, that Gamson's law, as Cutler et al. Put it, lacks deep theoretical underpinnings. And so in a search for deeper theoretical underpinnings, people turn to the formal literature looking at bargaining models. And the early bargaining models of government formation predicted that the formateur party, which would typically be a large party, the party that is proposing the new government, would end up being advantaged, would get a larger share of the government portfolios than they would get just purely based on their own resources. So to recap, according to Gamson, portfolios are going to be allocated proportionally. According to this original set of bargaining models, the prime ministerial party should get more than their fair share. So look at the data. There were a lot of studies. And this is kind of a typical example of what people found. So this is showing you government parties. And on the horizontal axis, I have each party's the share of the government seats that they are providing to the government. So this isn't their share of legislative seats overall, it's the share that they contribute to the government. This goes from 0 to 1. On the vertical axis, I have their share of the cabinet portfolios. On the 45-degree line tells us exact proportionality. So this actually looks very proportional, which like in favor of Gamson. And then you remember the bargaining models say, well, the prime ministerial parties should do less well than they should be disadvantaged, not get their fair share. And so here I've put the prime ministerial parties in pink and the other parties in yellow. So what we should see, according to the bargaining models, is we should see those pink parties up above the line and the yellow parties below. And in fact, we see the opposite. So we have this real world government formation process that's seen repeatedly in various studies that's actually characterized by a prime ministerial party disadvantage, right? Which is at odds with the predictions of the existing theoretical models. And so Warwick and Druckmann pointed this out to literature in 2001, saying we thus have a major disjuncture between the dominant theoretical direction on the issue of coalition payoffs and the available evidence. And other people took this up, and so some scholars spoke of a notorious contradiction, a stark contrast, fundamental tension between theory and empirics. And it's kind of it's a strange problem because you have your theoretical models and they seem good, and you have your empirics and it seems solid and they don't match, right? And so the question is, well, what do you do about that? And so one approach is you look at alternative measurement and estimation strategies, because maybe the empirical evidence that you're finding isn't real. So you could look at, for example, are some portfolios worth a lot more than others, right? And so if we take that into account, does that affect the results? Should we use bargaining weights instead of seat shares in terms of the resources that parties are contributing to the government? Should we take account of pre-electoral coalitions? Should we take account of the complexity of the bargaining process? Should we drop one party from each government when we're doing our estimations? A lot of interesting work, that's done here. And ultimately, people ended up finding like pretty consistent results. So the other approach is we need some new theoretical models whose predictions, right, are more in alignment with these empirical facts. And so there are a lot of really good sort of new models, more recent models, who give us, take different approaches and end up predicting proportionality, and sometimes, even a disadvantage for the prime ministerial party. One thing that these studies, most of these studies, the vast majority of these studies have in common is that they're focused on the same set of post-war Western European cases. There's nothing in any of the models that suggests that they should apply only to that set of cases. Right? The models are really general. Essentially, I think they could apply anywhere where you have a government formation process in a country with a vote of no confidence. And so that got us to thinking, how general is this empirical reality that's kind of motivating a lot of this work? And so we started gathering some new data. And so we start with what we call our core 14 sample. And these are the 14 post-war Western European countries that are most commonly used in our portfolio allocation studies. To that, we add a post-war global sample, 57 additional democracies. We have an interwar sample of European democracies. And finally, look at a subnational sample. We have Indian federal states. In this case, unit of analysis is the party. So I have party I within a cabinet, cabinet C. The dependent variable is the portfolio share. Our main independent variable is this dummy variable on, is the party a prime ministerial party or not? And then we're also going to account for the seat share. So the resources that the party is bringing to the government. The baseline model uses OLS with robust standard errors. We have a second model that includes country fixed effects and country cluster standard errors. We have a third model that includes cabinet fixed effects. We have supplementary materials that has a bazillion other models. And what we tried to do is test as many of the different approaches that we could find in the literature as possible. So the coefficient beta 1, this is our coefficient on prime ministerial party. That's our main quantity of interest. And it's going to tell us if these prime ministerial parties do better or worse than non-prime ministerial parties after we control for their resources. And so this coefficient has been found to be negative, by and large, in the post-war Western European samples in the existing literature. Here's the first coefficient plot. These are our 4 samples with our 3 models I mentioned. So this here, the first coefficient that's the baseline model in our core 14 sample. And so what we get, we replicate the results that everyone else has found. Prime ministerial parties are disadvantaged. When we look at our other samples, there's always a prime ministerial party bonus. And so here is, I'm just going to focus in on Europe. Not only because this is the Europe Center, but so this is post-war Western Europe. We've gone beyond the 14 to add a few more countries. Here, this takes the middle section. We're looking at the interwar years just with our core 14 sample. And then we're looking at interwar Western Europe. They're pretty similar. So what we're finding is that these empirical patterns of portfolio allocation that we've seen for decades that we've been studying in post-war Western Europe don't generalize, right? So we're seeing something, they're not representative of how ministerial portfolios get allocated more generally. And we also see considerable variation in the size of the prime ministerial party bonus across these different regions, time periods, and institutional settings. So our next steps are to try to figure this out. You could imagine various reasons why Western Europe looks different to other regions or post-war, different to other time periods. For example, maybe the party systems are more consolidated. Maybe the parties and the legislatures are more institutionalized. You could probably think of a lot of reasons why post-war Western Europe looks different. The challenge is figuring out why those factors would alter how the bargaining process works in such a way that the prime ministerial party is disadvantaged. And so more broadly, what we want to know is, why is the relationship between the executive and the legislature different in post-war Western Europe to other cases? All right. I'm going to conclude by trying to bring these two papers together. So in our first paper, we tried to just reconceptualize, redefine how we think about government alternatives as a way of bringing our empirical approach closer to our theoretical understanding of how government formation works. And this is going to allow us to jointly model prime ministerial party choice and government choice. In the second paper, I want to expand the empirical domain, sort of beyond post-war Western Europe, because in doing so, it overturns some of our conventional wisdom about what's happening in government formation processes and how parties are sharing power. And so together, I think the papers both speak to the importance of aligning our theory and our empirics, sort of more generally when we're studying government formation. And I'm hoping that you all are going to have some feedback and some suggestions about where we should go from here as we pursue both papers. As I said, these are both short papers, but they're meant to be first steps in kind of larger projects. So I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Going to open it up for the Q&A. So I'm going to just insert myself in that case. I'm going to start just very well. So it strikes me that one of the differences between the interwar Europe and post-war Europe is that interwar Europe is heavily polarized, and the other parties don't really have alternative coalitions to join, right? So the prime ministers can basically extract sort of more of a bonus because the other small parties don't have an alternative coalition to join, given the very high levels of polarization. After World War II, when you have a situation where in most countries you have these large mainstream parties of governance, the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, and they know they're going to be in government, right? I mean, in Sweden, the Social Democrats are in power basically, God knows how long. Same with Italy with the Christian Democrats. And so they're willing to make more concessions because they still know that over the long run, they're going to control government. So they're sort of expected, they're basically looking at the sort of the long run, and they know that they'll keep coming back. And so they can afford to be more generous.
So are you saying that they're kind of trading off a smaller share of the pie for having it for longer?
Yeah, and I mean, so you can think of it in two ways, right? What are some of the options for the other parties that join the coalition? And in the interwar period, it's either these sort of parties or bust, right? Because it's such a heavily polarized system that alternative coalitions are very unlikely, so they have no exit option. So they'll take sort of, the prime minister party gets more because the other parties are willing to accept less in order to join the coalition if they want chance of governance. After World War II, that's no longer the case, right? And you have these sort of large parties that aren't particularly polarized, and the other parties can leave or not leave the coalition. Those big parties already know that they're coming back to power anyway, and so the prime ministerial bonus falls out because the smaller parties have more exit options. And
they cost more in some sense. Okay. So that suggests that when we update our data and we get more of the recent, like increasingly polarized and fragmented legislatures.
Yeah. You should see
a shift.
Small, yeah.
Okay. So we essentially, that also suggests then that these other kind of legislatures around the world are either more polarized or prime ministers there
or just the smaller parties don't
Yeah.
have other options, right? I think the best way to put it, and there might be various reasons for this, but it's the exit option for the smaller parties, and can they join an alternative coalition? Okay.
So I had a different European story. I'll start in the 19th century. So we'll go with Estra, who was Prime Minister of Denmark for 20 odd years, despite having a minority of seats and never being able to pass his budget. And the reason he was able to survive, very much against any of our theories, is that the king kept appointing. So that's the variable there is there an actor somewhat like a 19th century European monarch who has a prerogative right to decide who is the formateur or even to directly appoint? When we looked at the interwar period, what we thought we saw was European monarchs in 414 still exerting substantial, not quite 18th century English favoritism to, favored governments, but putting their thumb on the weighing scale frequently and fairly openly in the sort of Europe. And each of the European core 14 at some point, at least the monarchies, there comes a couple of break points where they sort of break. My interpretation of the big interwar, it could also be this. For the reason small parties don't have any exit options, and they know that the king is not going to help them out in any way, or so I think some of the presidential meetings in Europe also have some of that. We've got some things that are trying to, but that would be just a general thing to cover.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I assume everyone here has already read it, but if you haven't, Gary's piece with Osnat Akharov is one of the few that actually focuses on the interwar years, right? So it's very interesting.
Yeah, thanks. I have a couple of little points or questions. First, I was wondering whether you have looked into the existence of all kinds of constitutional rules or norms with respect to how to divide government portfolios. I grew up in Belgium. I'm sorry, I'm going to use Belgium as an example, maybe on more than one point. But in Belgium, first of all, there's a constitutional rule that you need the same number of Francophone and Dutch-speaking ministers, with the possible exception of the prime minister. So given that there are fewer Francophones, they have fewer seats, those parties, they are usually overrepresented then as a result. Plus, there is also a norm of just applying the Don system to the division of the portfolios. Of course, they could deviate from that without violating any law or constitution, but that's the way they usually do it. And so that would, to some extent, I guess, have an impact on the conclusions, the extent to which they have these kind of rules in more than just Belgium. And I do think that in some other countries they do it somewhat similarly sometimes. Another thing that is also related to fragmentation, even though it may not work the same way as in the previous comments, it could be that that smaller parties are sometimes overrepresented because they want at least one government portfolio. And so, for example, I'll use Belgium again. If you have constitutionally provided number of government ministries, 15, maximum 15, of course, they always use 15.
Yeah.
And you have 7 parties in government, there's not all that much that you can deviate from the average. So that may also play a role in a number of countries where the party system has become very fragmented. Two other small points. Another thing is that they may, at the government formation stage, they may take other positions into account, the speakership of the House, the European Commissioner, or something like that. And then my final little point that I was thinking about, these are all points about the second paper. Of course, you talked about power. Number of portfolios a party has doesn't necessarily mean that they have more power. I mean, to give an example of the European Commission, I know it's not a government formation, or at least the way it is put together, it's not the same as a regular government formation process, but it's quite different if you're commissioner for competition policy as opposed to commissioner for multilingualism, as there once was a commissioner. So anyway, these are to some extent obvious points, I think, but
worth thinking about. Thank you.
You're able to look at a temporal factor whereby if you look at the Cold War period versus the post-Cold War period, so there may be power.
Although, just to insert, I mean, that also coincides with, the destruction of the Italian party system, the end of the Swedish, the social democratic hegemony, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, yeah,
A lot of things happen.
true. We haven't, no, I mean, we haven't really taken temporal variation into account other than, by adding the interwar years. And again, the challenge is trying to think of, so what's different about the post-war era that is going to affect government formation? Is that going to happen everywhere? Is it going to, maybe just affect Western Europe? Again, we're trying to figure out, why does Western Europe look weird? Here, post-war Western Europe.
I said it looks weird. That's the template for everything else.
Well, see, I was telling some colleagues about this talk, and they said, you're going to the Europe Center and you're going to say that like Europe's, Western Europe's different, like people are going to be mad. And I said, I don't think so. Like, I think
I'm not sensing a lot of anger in this room.
I find it interesting, and I'm, hoping they'll have a lot of ideas.
Vytautas Kokštis, visiting researcher from Vilnius University. I just had this small technical question. I noticed in one of the slides you had a negative coefficient on the quadratic term. So what's the explanation for that?
Oh, the idea is, so we're thinking about the size of the potential government. So as a potential government gets larger, you imagine it's getting close to majority size. Like, that's actually very helpful. And then at some point, a potential government is so large, maybe because it has so many parties in it, that's actually makes it less likely to get into office.
Other questions? Comments? All right. Well, in that case, Sona, thank you very much for a very provocative talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.